Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about sewage or wastewater treatment. Now, first of all, there are a few vocab terms that you need to know. We will see the terms influent and effluent throughout this section here. Influent is just the fancy word for the water coming into the treatment or into that particular step. And effluent describes the water that is exiting or leaving that particular step or the overall treatment facility. Now there's two main methods. We have septic systems and we have the industrial or municipal wastewater treatment facilities or the sewage treatment plants. Now a septic system treats the waste oftentimes from one single home, and these are usually found out in rural areas. The larger treatment facilities would treat the waste from several homes or entire communities at one central location, and the size and some of the methods that are used really depends on that volume of water that's coming into the treatment facility that needs to be processed. Starting here with septic systems with one single home, you will want to draw a sketch of this into your notes. The waste from the home goes through the pipes out into a large tank that is buried oftentimes in the backyard, and the waste spends a fair amount of time inside of this tank going through anaerobic decomposition. There's a few baffles in there to prevent the waste from moving very quickly through the tank, and then at the other end of the tank is a leach field. Now a leach field is a series of pipes that allows that treated water to slowly filter out into the soil and back into the environment. Now look a little closer here at a septic tank. We have the inlet pipe from the home brings that liquid into the tank. There's usually a layer of scum and debris that floats to the top of the tank, and then the solids usually go down to the bottom and create a sludge. Typically, you are going to want to get your septic tank pumped out every now and then to remove some of that floating debris and that settled sludge that's at the bottom. However, if your tank is functioning properly and if you are not flushing any debris down the toilet, you shouldn't need to have that constant maintenance. However, in many communities, that is actually a requirement to have that tank pumped every few years. After the liquid has sat inside of the tank for a fair amount of time, it then is pushed out the outlet pipe. Now, while that liquid's sitting inside the tank, there's a whole lot of bacteria that's in there that is breaking down all of the nasty stuff in the waste. So really, we are relying on good bacteria to treat the waste before that water then leaves the tank. Now, a sewage treatment plant or a wastewater treatment facility does the same thing, but on a much larger scale. And there are usually several steps involved in this treatment. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary treatment. In primary treatment, this is the physical removal of objects using screens and settling tanks. This is our first step as that waste comes into the plant. Then, during secondary treatment, this is when we're using that bacteria to break down the waste. But in a wastewater treatment plant, we're using aerobic bacteria instead of anaerobic bacteria that is used in a septic tank. After that bacteria has time to break down all of the waste, that liquid goes to a clarifier where that bacteria settles out to the bottom and then is pumped back in to be reused in that aeration tank. Finally, that water then moves on to tertiary treatment where it is disinfected, and a few common methods would be using either chlorine or ozone or UV light and even sometimes filters to remove any of those bacteria that might remain. Let's look a little closer here at primary treatment. Typically, as that waste comes in, these are just large bar screens. In the large facilities, there will be a rake that automatically scrapes off anything that gets stuck on the screen, and that waste is then sent to a landfill for disposal. In smaller communities, you actually have to rake this off by hand, and then again, you collect those rags, is what they're called. So that would be toilet paper or really anything that's not human waste that is put down the drain that collects on that bar. And again, that gets sent to a landfill. Another step in primary treatment would be this primary clarifier. Now, not all wastewater treatment facilities have primary clarifiers. The main goal with them is to remove any grit and any fats, oils, or greases. So what happens is the water is pumped up the middle pipe in this, and it is allowed to settle in this clarifier, which is a really large tank. So the solids will sink down to the bottom, where a bar will move around a circle in the bottom and scrape that down into a middle well, where that's then sent to a landfill for disposal. And the greases and oils will float to the top, and again, a bar will move around the top and scrape those off to collect them, and again, send it out for disposal at a landfill. Then the effluent from primary treatment becomes the influent at secondary treatment, and it comes into the aeration tank. Now, the aeration tank has a whole bunch of little air diffusers at the bottom, and it's a whole bunch of bubbles being pumped into the tank. There's also a whole bunch of good bacteria that's being added into the aeration tank, and that good bacteria is often called activated sludge. Now, that activated sludge, or the good bacteria, is going to break down all of the nasty stuff that's in the wastewater. And then after that water spent a period of time in that tank, it will then go to a secondary clarifier, very similar to that primary clarifier. However, in this one, we're trying to get our good bacteria and solids to settle out to the bottom so we can use those bacteria over and over again. And we're trying to get our water to be nice and clear. Now, in some wastewater treatment facilities, this is the end, but not all of them, particularly in places that have more regulations and larger communities. They then go to a tertiary treatment. So the effluent from secondary treatment becomes the influent. In tertiary treatment, you could have a filtration system, and this is a diagram of what that looks like. On the left-hand side, you can see the water comes in from secondary treatment and then passes through a series of filters to remove any of that remaining bacteria. Now, that filter will eventually become clogged. So what they can do is this system called backwashing, and that's on the right-hand side. And you can see that air is pushed to go backwards through the filter to push any of those particles out to then collect them and send that back through the wastewater treatment. Another method would be using chlorine to disinfect the wastewater. Now, there's two ways you can do this. You can just add that chlorine into the tank, and it usually snakes through what's called a chlorine contact chamber. So that way the water has a fair amount of time for this chlorine to mix around within there and kill any bacteria that remains. But the problem is, as that chlorine reacts with some of those remaining pollutants, it can produce some byproducts, and it also changes the pH of that effluent. And you need to make sure that the water that's leaving the wastewater treatment plant has plenty of dissolved oxygen and it enters that natural water body. So what we often do is add this dechlorination. So you chlorinate the water, moves through the contact chamber, and then at the end of the contact chamber, you add this other chemical to neutralize that chlorine. And then, of course, we re-aerate the water. So sometimes it goes over a little waterfall. Sometimes you have more of those discs that push a bunch of bubbles into the water. And then finally, that effluent goes out into the water body. You could do this with UV, and it looks a little sci-fi, and you are just treating that water to kill bacteria using ultraviolet light. Now, you're not making any chemical byproducts, so that's a benefit. However, this is more energy intensive than using that chemical to disinfect the water. Now, in summary, you should be able to describe some of these best practices in sewage treatment, should be able to describe the difference between a sewage treatment plant, so these large-scale facilities, and a septic tank or a septic system that is used in a home. Keep in mind that not all wastewater treatment facilities are these big plants. In many small communities, these are much smaller. Sometimes they are all contained inside of a single building. But in these large communities and large cities, you're going to see a large array like what you see in this image. So in this image, those circles are the clarifiers. The rectangles that have little curves on the end, those are the raceways where the secondary treatment is happening with the aeration. And I would be willing to guess that the chlorine contact or the disinfection tertiary step is taking place somewhere inside or underneath one of those buildings. Now, please send me your questions here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.